By 1943, the Japanese commanders in the Pacific thought they understood American air power. They knew the heavy bombers, the B-17s and B-24s, flew high. They dropped bombs from 20,000 feet. They were inaccurate against ships, and while they could level a base, they gave plenty of warning. They knew the carrier planes, the Dauntless and Avengers, were deadly, but they were tied to the fleet. If the American carriers weren't around, the skies were relatively safe. The Japanese did not expect the U.S. Marine Corps to fly bombers. To the Japanese mind, Marines were infantry. They stormed beaches. They didn't fly twin-engine medium bombers on long-range maritime patrols. This blind spot led to a fatal complacency regarding their coastal shipping lanes. The Japanese relied on barges and destroyers, the Tokyo Express, to move supplies at night, believing that darkness protected them from American air power. They assumed that American land-based bombers couldn't operate effectively at night against moving ships. They were wrong. The U.S. Navy, realizing it needed land-based patrol aircraft but having a shortage of crews, had offered a deal to the Marines: "We will give you B-25 Mitchells if you fly them." The Marines accepted. They designated the plane the PBJ. PB for patrol bomber. J for North American Aviation, the manufacturer. But the Marines didn't want to use them for high-altitude bombing. That wasn't the Marine way. Marines like to get close. They like to see the enemy's eyes. So, they took a medium bomber designed for level flight and turned it into a low-level brawler. The Japanese garrisons on Rabaul and Bougainville would watch the skies for high-altitude formations, unaware that the threat wasn't coming from the clouds. It was coming from the wave tops. And it wasn't coming to bomb them. It was coming to hunt them. The PBJ was about to introduce the Japanese Navy to a new kind of warfare, armed reconnaissance by maniacs who flew bombers like they were fighters. When the PBJs arrived in the Pacific, they looked different from their Army cousins. The Army B-25s were usually olive drab or bare aluminum. The Marine PBJs were painted in the U.S. Navy's tricolor scheme: dark sea blue on top, intermediate blue on the sides, and white on the bottom. They were beautiful, camouflaged for operation over the open ocean. But the differences went deeper than paint. The Marines modified the aircraft for their specific needs. They added extra fuel tanks for long overwater patrols. They added specialized radios to communicate with the fleet and with Marine ground units. But the biggest change was the radar. Most Army B-25s bombed visually. The Marine PBJs were fitted with the AN/APS-3 search radar. This radar was housed in a distinctive pod. On early models, PBJs 1C and D, it was a retractable dustbin turret under the belly. On later models, PBJs 1H and J, it was a bulbous pod mounted on the right wingtip. This radar gave the PBJ a superpower: it could see in the dark. It could detect a Japanese destroyer from 30 miles away in pitch blackness. It could spot a surface submarine or a convoy of barges through heavy rain. The Japanese had nothing like this. Their radar technology was primitive and mostly land-based. They relied on lookouts with binoculars. The PBJ crews trained to fly on instruments. They learned to trust the green glow of the radar screen. They practiced blind approaches, flying just feet above the water, guided solely by the radar blips. This technology transformed the PBJ from a daylight bomber into a 24-hour predator. The Japanese commanders, secure in their belief that the night belongs to the Navy, had no idea that the Marines had brought a flashlight into the dark room. The Blue Mitchells were coming, and they didn't need the sun to find their targets. The standard B-25 Mitchell was built with a glass nose. Inside sat a bombardier with a Norden bomb sight. It was designed to fly straight and level, drop bombs on a factory, and go home. The Marines looked at the glass nose and saw a waste of space. Bombing from altitude against maneuvering ships was nearly impossible. The hit rate was less than 1%. The Marines decided they didn't need a bombardier. They needed more guns. They began to modify the airframes. In the field, and later at the factory, with the PBJ's 1H and J models, they replaced the glass greenhouse with a solid nose. And they packed that nose with .50 caliber machine guns. Lots of them. A standard PBJ-1J carried 8.50 caliber machine guns in the nose, plus for mooring blister packs on the sides of the fuselage, plus 2 in the top turret. When a PBJ pilot pulled the trigger, he was unleashing a storm of lead that rivaled a heavy cruiser's broadside. 12 to 14 machine guns firing forward. This turned the bomber into a straffer. The tactics changed completely. The PBJ would dive at a shallow angle, or fly level at mast height. The pilot would open fire at 1,000 yards. The stream of heavy bullets would sweep the deck of the Japanese ship. It would shred the unarmored bridge. It would kill the anti-aircraft gunners. It would punch holes in the hull plating. By the time the PBJ flew over the ship to drop its bombs, the ship was often already burning and defenseless. The solid nose conversion was a rejection of traditional bomber doctrine. It was an admission that in the Pacific, accuracy was achieved by getting close, and safety was achieved by suppressing the enemy with overwhelming firepower. The Japanese sailors, used to seeing bombers high above, were terrified by the sight of these blue monsters charging straight at them, noses sparking with fire. It wasn't bombing, it was a drive-by shooting at 300 miles per hour. As if 12 machine guns weren't enough, the Marines adopted the ultimate bunker buster. The PBJ-1H. This variant carried a weapon that belonged on a tank, not a plane. The T-13E 175mm cannon. It was a massive artillery piece mounted in the nose of the aircraft. It fired a 15-pound high-explosive shell. The gun was so big that it had to be hand-loaded by the navigator. He would take a shell from the rack, slide it into the breech, and tap the pilot on the shoulder to let him know the gun was hot. The pilot would aim the entire plane at the target. When he fired, the plane shuddered. The recoil stopped the aircraft's forward momentum momentarily, or felt like it. A massive smoke ring would puff out of the muzzle. The effect on the target was devastating. A single 75mm shell could sink a small coastal freighter. It could blow the turret off a Japanese tank. It could destroy a concrete pillbox. The Marines used the cannon for anti-shipping and anti-barge missions. Japanese supply barges, made of wood or light steel, were immune to torpedoes. They ran too shallow and hard to hit with bombs. But a 75mm shell turned them into matchsticks. The Japanese troops on these barges had no defense. They would see the PBJ approaching, see the flash of the big gun, and then oblivion. The cannon had a slow rate of fire, maybe 3 or 4 shots in a single attack run. But the psychological impact was immense. The Japanese realized the Americans were flying artillery batteries. There was no cover thick enough, no ship hull strong enough, to withstand a direct hit from a 75mm flying cannon. The H-model PBJ was the ultimate expression of the Marine Corps philosophy: use the biggest gun you can carry, and get as close as possible. It was a brute force solution to the problem of Japanese logistics. And it worked. The true revolution of the PBJ wasn't its guns, it was its eye. The ANEAPS-3 search radar. In 1943, radar was still a bulky, mysterious technology. Most aircraft radar was designed for night fighters to find other planes. The Marines used it to find ships. The radar set was housed in a fiberglass pod on the wingtip or under the belly. Inside the cockpit, the radar operator, RO, sat hunched over a small, circular screen. It glowed with an eerie green light. A sweeping line, the trace, rotated around the screen. When it hit a solid object, like a ship, it painted a bright blip. The RO became the most important man in the crew. He could see through clouds. He could see through rain. He could see through the darkest tropical night. The Japanese captains relied on the cover of darkness. They believed that if they couldn't see the Americans couldn't see them. They were wrong. A PBJ patrolling at 1,000 feet could detect a Japanese convoy from 40 miles away. The RO would guide the pilot. Target bearing 030. Range 20 miles. The pilot would turn the plane, flying blind, trusting the voice in his headset. As they got closer, the blip would separate into individual ships. 2 destroyers, 3 transports, the RO would say. The Japanese had primitive radar detectors, METOCs, but they were rare and ineffective against the frequency of the American sets. So, the Japanese ships sailed on, oblivious. The PBJ crews developed a terrifying proficiency. They could set up an attack run entirely on instruments. They would descend to 200 feet, mast height. The pilot would only look up from his instruments at the last possible second, when the dark shape of the enemy ship loomed out of the mist. By then, it was too late for the Japanese to react. The radar gave the Marines the element of surprise every single time. It turned the vast, empty Pacific Ocean into a transparent fishbowl. The Japanese commanders couldn't understand how their secret supply runs were being intercepted with such uncanny precision. They suspected spies. They suspected coast watchers. They never suspected that a medium bomber was watching them from beyond the horizon with an electronic eye. The Marines didn't just want to destroy the enemy, they wanted to drive them crazy. They developed a tactic called heckling. A lone PBJ would take off at dusk. It would fly to a Japanese base, like Rabaul or Kavieng. It wouldn't drop all its bombs at once. It would loiter. The pilot would throttle back the engines to save fuel. He would circle the Japanese airfield in the darkness. Every 20 or 30 minutes, he would drop a single bomb. Or a flare. The Japanese searchlights would snap on, sweeping the sky frantically. The anti-aircraft guns would fire blindly into the dark. The air raid sirens would wail. Thousands of Japanese soldiers would rush to the bunkers. Then, silence. The PBJ would drift away into the darkness. 30 minutes later, just as the all clear sounded and the soldiers went back to sleep, the PBJ would return. Boom! Another bomb. This psychological torture would go on all night. The Japanese garrison got no sleep. Their nerves were frayed. The next day, exhausted and jumpy, they were less effective in combat. The hecklers also paralyzed Japanese logistics. Work crews couldn't repair the runway. Mechanics couldn't fix the Zeros. Ships couldn't unload at the docks. A single airplane, with a crew of 5, could shut down an entire major base for 12 hours. It was an incredibly efficient use of resources. The Japanese tried to send up night fighters, but without radar, they couldn't find the lone bomber in the vast black sky. The PBJ crews loved these missions. They felt like ghosts haunting the enemy. They knew that the sound of their engines, the unsynchronized throb of the twin Wright cyclones, was the sound of insomnia for the Japanese Empire. The Japanese commanders, red-eyed and desperate, realized that the Americans had taken away the night. There was no rest. There was no safety. There was only the waiting for the next bomb. The Tokyo Express was the lifeline of the Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands. It was a fleet of fast destroyers used as transports. They would dash down the slot, New Georgia Sound, at night, drop off troops and supplies on Guadalcanal or Bougainville, and race back before dawn. They were fast, heavily armed, and dangerous. Conventional bombers couldn't hit them. Torpedo boats were outgunned. But the PBJ was the perfect counterweapon. The Marines adapted a tactic called skip bombing, or masthead bombing. Instead of dropping a bomb from high altitude, the PBJ pilot would fly at 250 miles per hour, just 50 feet above the water. He would aim straight at the side of the Japanese destroyer. When he released the bomb, it wouldn't plummet. It would hit the water and skip, like a stone skipping across a pond. Ideally, it would slam into the side of the ship, right at the water line, and explode. Or, it would skip over the ship and explode in the water on the other side, acting like a depth charge and breaking the hull. It was a game of chicken. The Japanese destroyers would fill the air with flak. 25 mm and 127 mm shells. The PBJ would charge straight into the fire, its nose guns, the 8 to 12 machine guns, hammering the destroyer's bridge and gun tubs to suppress the fire. Then, thump thump thump. The bombs would skip into the steel hull. The results were catastrophic. A destroyer that took a skip bomb hit usually broke in half. The Tokyo Express began to derail. Japanese destroyers, the pride of the fleet, were being sunk by clumsy bombers. The loss of these ships was unsustainable. Japan had very few destroyers. Every one lost meant fewer escorts for the carriers and the merchant fleet. The PBJ crews turned the night runs into a gauntlet of death. The Japanese sailors learned to dread the sound of low-flying aircraft. They knew that if they saw the twin-tailed silhouette of a Mitchell skimming the waves, they had seconds to live. The Marines had proven that a bomber could fight a warship and win. The sophistication of the PBJ, its radar, its guns, its engines, stood in stark contrast to the conditions of its bases. The Marine squadrons operated from forward areas. Places like Sterling Island, Green Island, and Emiror. These weren't air bases. They were clearings in the jungle. The runways were made of crushed coral. It was white, abrasive, and turned into a blinding dust storm when a plane took off. When it rained, the taxiways turned into mud pits. The heat was suffocating. Humidity was 100%. The mechanics worked in the open, under the blazing sun or torrential tropical rain. They fought mosquitoes, dysentery, and malaria while trying to maintain complex radial engines and sensitive radar sets. Tools rusted overnight. Fungus grew on the optical sights. Yet, the PBJ kept flying. It was a testament to the rugged design of North American aviation and the sheer grit of the Marine ground crews. They improvised. They used coconut logs to jack up planes. They made gaskets out of old rubber boots. They patched bullet holes with flattened tin cans. The Japanese hoped the jungle would defeat the Americans. They believed that Westerners were too soft to endure the tropics. But the Marines thrived in the squalor. They lived in tents, ate spam, and drank jungle juice, homemade alcohol. And every night, they launched their blue bombers to hunt the enemy. The contrast was striking, high-tech radar warfare launched from a Neolithic swamp. The Japanese commanders, whose own planes were rotting in the humid air due to lack of maintenance, couldn't understand how the Americans kept up the pressure. They didn't realize that the most dangerous component of the PBJ wasn't the gun or the radar. It was the 19-year-old mechanic from Brooklyn who refused to let the plane stay grounded, no matter how much mud he had to crawl through. Here are the final 4 sections of the documentary script, completing the story of the Marine Corps PBJ Mitchell. By 1944, the Japanese had gone underground. On islands like Peleliu and Okinawa, they stopped fighting on the beaches and retreated into massive cave complexes and concrete bunkers. Bombs were useless. They exploded on the surface, leaving the caves untouched. Napalm could burn the entrances, but it couldn't penetrate deep inside. The PBJ crews needed a drill. They found it in the HVAR, the high-velocity aircraft rocket. Nicknamed Holy Moses by the crews, supposedly because of the reaction of the first pilot who fired one, these were 5-inch solid-fuel rockets. They carried a 45-pound warhead, equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. The PBJ-01J could carry 8 or 10 of them on launch rails under the wings. Unlike the 75mm cannon, the rockets had no recoil. A pilot could fire them in pairs or in a single, devastating ripple salvo. The accuracy was terrifying. Because the rocket accelerated instantly to 1,000 miles per hour, it flew in a flat, straight line. It went exactly where the nose of the plane was pointing. The Marine pilots treated them like giant bullets. They would dive on a Japanese cave entrance, a target maybe 10 feet wide, from a mile away. They would unleash a salvo. The rockets would streak ahead, leaving trails of white smoke. They would fly right into the mouth of the cave and detonate deep inside. The explosion would collapse the tunnel, bury the defenders, or kill them with the concussive overpressure. For the Japanese troops hiding in the dark, the sound of a rocket attack was the sound of inevitable death. There was no whistle like a bomb or shell. Just a whoosh and an explosion. The PBJ had evolved from a bomber into a close support siege weapon. It was doing the job of a tank, but doing it from the air at 300 miles per hour. The addition of rockets made the PBJ the most heavily armed medium bomber of the war. Between the nose guns, the cannon, on H models, the bombs, and the rockets, a single plane could level a fortress. The Japanese engineers who built the caves thought they were safe under 50 feet of rock. They didn't account for the holy Moses. The defining characteristic of a PBJ attack was the element of pop-up surprise. The Japanese lookouts were trained to scan the sky. They looked up at a 45-degree angle, searching for high-altitude bombers. But the PBJ pilots flew on the deck. They flew so low that their propellers kicked up spray from the ocean. They flew below the horizon line. To a Japanese sailor on a transport ship, the ocean would look empty. Then, suddenly, the horizon would spit out a monster. At a range of 3 miles, the PBJ would pop up over the curvature of the Earth. It would be closing at 300 miles per hour. This gave the Japanese gunners less than 30 seconds to react. They had to spot the plane, identify it, slew their heavy anti-aircraft guns around, aim, and fire. It was impossible. By the time the alarm sounded, the PBJ was already within strafing range. The air would fill with the roar of the twin Wright Cyclone engines and the hammer of the .50 caliber machine guns. The Japanese bridge crews would be cut down before they could reach the telegraph to order an evasive turn. This pop-up tactic was psychologically devastating. It created a sense of paranoia. The horizon, which should have been empty, was always threatening. Even on land, the PBJs used the terrain. They would fly down valleys, hidden by the ridge lines. They would pop over a hill, drop a load of parafrags, parachute-retarded fragmentation bombs, on a Japanese troop concentration, and disappear back into the valley before the dust settled. The Japanese infantry called them the Whispering Death, not to be confused with the Beaufighter or Corsair, because you didn't hear them until they were on top of you. The Marine pilots took a perverse pride in their ability to sneak up on an entire army. They weren't flying in the stratosphere, detached from the war. They were down in the mud and the spray, fighting a knife fight at 300 knots. Ultimately, the PBJ existed for one reason: to help the Marine on the ground. The Marine Corps is a unique organization. It has its own Air Force, and that Air Force has only one priority: supporting the infantry. In the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, this relationship was forged in blood. The fighting was close. Sometimes the lines were separated by only 50 yards. Army Air Force bombers, flying from high altitude, couldn't bomb that close. It was too dangerous. But the PBJs could. The Marine pilots on the ground, forward air controllers, FACs, would talk the PBJs in. "Okay, Blue Raider, I need you to hit the ridge line 100 yards north of the red smoke." The PBJ would come in low. Dangerously low. The pilots could see the faces of their fellow Marines in the foxholes. They would open fire with their nose guns, suppressing the Japanese heads. Then they would drop napalm or bombs with surgical precision. They were flying so low that they sometimes returned to base with Japanese telephone wire wrapped around their landing gear or palm fronds stuck in their bomb bays. The grunts loved them. When they were pinned down, dying in the dirt, the sound of those twin engines was the sound of salvation. They would stand up and cheer as the blue planes strafed the enemy trenches. It was a bond of trust. The infantry trusted the pilots not to hit them. The pilots risked flak and small arms fire to protect the infantry. This close air support, CAS, doctrine is the hallmark of the Marine Corps today. It was perfected in the cockpits of the PBJs. While the B-29s were burning cities, the PBJs were saving lives, one platoon at a time. The Japanese had no answer for this coordination. Their own army and navy hated each other and rarely cooperated. They were fighting a unified team where the air and ground moved as one muscle. When the war ended, the PBJs were unceremoniously scrapped. They were flown to boneyards in the Philippines or pushed into the ocean. They were old, war-weary, and surplus to requirements. History largely forgot them. When people think of the B-25 Mitchell, they think of the Doolittle raid or the Army Air Forces in Europe. They forget the Blue Mitchells of the Pacific. But the legacy of the PBJ is profound. It proved that a medium bomber could be a maritime strike aircraft. It proved that radar could turn night into day. And most importantly, it cemented the Marine Corps concept of the air-ground team. The Japanese commanders had ignored the PBJ. They thought it was just another bomber. They realized too late that it was a Swiss Army knife of destruction. It could bomb, strafe, hunt ships, bust bunkers, and fly at night. It strangled the supply lines at Rabaul. It cleared the beaches at Iwo Jima. It was the workhorse that did the dirty jobs the glamour planes couldn't do. Today, there is only one flying PBJ or 1J left in the world. When it flies at airshows, it is a rare sight. The blue paint stands out against the sea of olive-drab warbirds. But for the Marines who fought in the Pacific, that blue silhouette was the most beautiful thing in the sky. It was the symbol that the cavalry had arrived, and it was bringing heavy guns. The Japanese mocked the infantry's Marines. But the infantry had wings. And those wings cast a shadow that eclipsed the rising sun.